Heartless millionaire kicks his wife out of the house because she can't have children. 7 years later, he's shocked to see his ex-wife with twins who look exactly like him. The Sterling estate was cloaked in an eerie kind of quiet, the kind that wasn't peaceful but oppressive. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the parlor marked the passing minutes like a judge announcing a sentence. Graham Sterling sat in the library, his broad shoulders hunched as he stared at a tumbler of untouched bourbon on the mahogany desk before him. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its warmth failing to reach the cold knot tightening in his chest. His mother's words from that morning echoed in his mind, sharp and unyielding. "She's barren, Graham. Do you understand what that means for this family? For the Sterling name? It's time to end this charade before it costs you everything." Everything. Evelyn Sterling, regal and unbending, had stood before him like a figure carved from ice. She hadn't raised her voice. She never needed to. Her words sliced through the air with precision, designed to cut, not wound. "You're the head of this family now," she continued, each syllable deliberate. "A Sterling doesn't cling to dead weight, especially not a girl from nowhere with no bloodline, no connections, and no heirs." Graham's jaw tightened. "Nora is my wife." Evelyn had waved her manicured hand dismissively, her diamond bracelet catching the morning light. "And she's had 3 years to fulfill her role. Don't have a single child. How much longer are you willing to let this continue before it ruins you?" "Ruins us?" Graham felt the pressure of his mother's expectations, crushing him like a vice. He clenched his fists until the knuckles whitened, but the trembling in his hands betrayed him. Nora hummed softly as she folded laundry in the small sitting room, sunlight streaming through the bay window. The soft notes of her voice filled the space, weaving a fragile piece into the fabric of the day. She glanced at the clock, her expression softening. Graham would be home soon. Her hands moved rhythmically, but her mind wandered. She thought of the way Graham used to smile at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners like he couldn't contain his joy. Lately, that smile had become scarce, replaced by a tension she didn't know how to soothe. The weight of their unspoken failures, particularly hers, hovered between them like a specter. The door creaked open, and Graham's footsteps echoed down the hall. She looked up, her heart quickening with both relief and apprehension. He hesitated in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the dim light of the corridor. "You're home early," Nora said, her tone light but tinged with nervousness. She sat down the shirt she had been folding and wiped her hands on her apron. "I was thinking we could, Nora." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it stopped her mid-sentence. She froze, her smile faltering. Graham stepped into the room, his gaze darting to the floor as if he couldn't bear to meet her eyes. His hands found the back of a chair, gripping it tightly. The silence stretched between them, the air thick with unspoken words. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice strained. "About us." Her brows knit together, and she stepped closer. "Graham, what's wrong?" The tenderness in her voice, which had once grounded him, now twisted him with guilt. He forced himself to look at her, her delicate features, the way her hair fell softly over her shoulders, her eyes full of concern. I think we need to separate." The words dropped like stones into the fragile stillness of the room. For a moment, Nora didn't move, didn't breathe. Her lips parted slightly as if she were about to speak, but no sound came. "What?" she finally whispered, her voice cracking. "Why are you saying this?" Graham's throat tightened. He struggled to express the truth to her, realizing that his mother's ultimatum had compelled him to act, and his love for her was insufficient to overcome the burden of the Sterling name. Instead, he leaned into the lie that had been rehearsed in his head, though it tasted like ash on his tongue. "This isn't working, Nora. It's been 3 years, and we're not building the life we hoped for." Her eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "Graham, we can fix this." "We can. It's not something we can fix. he interrupted, his voice harder than he intended. "It's just not over." Nora's breath hitched, and she stepped back as if he had struck her. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, the place where life had never taken root. The gesture made Graham's chest ache, but he didn't reach for her. The clock chimed softly, a cruel reminder of time slipping away. Nora finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Is this because of me?" "Because No," he said quickly, too quickly. "It's just ... What has to be?" She stood there, her frame fragile yet unbroken. "If you walk away from me, Graham, I don't think I'll ever forgive you." Graham swallowed hard, the weight of her words crashing over him. But he turned away, his steps heavy as he left the room. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed through the house like the final note of a funeral dirge. In the empty silence that followed, Nora sank into the chair he had gripped moments earlier. The warmth of his touch lingered on the wood, a cruel reminder of what she had lost. The storm outside the Sterling estate mirrored the chaos in Nora's chest. Rain lashed against the tall windows, streaking the glass like tears. She stood in the foyer, her small suitcase by her feet, trembling fingers wrapped around the handle. Graham was perched on the edge of the staircase, his back rigid as if the banister behind him held him upright. He avoided her gaze, staring somewhere beyond her shoulder. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white. "Graham," Nora's voice broke, soft and raw. "Please, just tell me why." His jaw tightened, a slight movement that revealed the tension coiled within him. He didn't answer. 3 years, Graham." Her words spilled out, shaky but unrelenting. 3 years of a marriage you promised would stand against anything. You stood right there. She gestured toward the grand archway where they'd exchanged vows. "And you told me we'd face every storm together. And now her voice cracked, faltering under the weight of her grief. "Now you're asking me to leave." "It's better this way," he muttered, still refusing to look at her. His tone was clipped and cold, and it struck her like a slap. "Better for who?" She whispered, her breath hitching. "For your mother? For your legacy? What about us, Graham? What about me?" When he finally lifted his eyes to hers, the resolve there did nothing to soften the blow. "This isn't about anyone else, Nora. This is about what's right." She stumbled back a step, her chest cinching as if the air had been sucked from the room. She searched his features, desperate for the man who had once made her laugh until she cried, who had cradled her hand like it was something holy. But he was gone, buried beneath expectations she couldn't fight. "Right," she echoed, bitterness threading the single word. Her fingers shook as she reached for the suitcase, hefting it with an effort that felt heavier than it should. "If this is your version of right, then you've lost far more than me, Graham." Her heels struck the polished marble as she moved toward the door. She paused, glanced back one last time, her voice quiet but unwavering. "You'll regret this." The rain met her outside with a cold slap. Her thin cardigan did little against the wind that needled her cheeks, sending shivers skittering down her spine. The suitcase thumped her legs as she made her way down the drive, the grand Sterling estate looming behind like an empty shell. Nora didn't look back. The train thrummed as it crossed into Seattle's limits, steel wheels humming a rhythm that matched the churn of her thoughts. She watched the rain-streaked window, her reflection blurred against the glass. The skyline rose ahead, jagged against the blank sky. Her grip tightened on her bag strap, the small life she'd packed pressing into her palm. A few clothes. A worn wedding photo tucked into the pocket of a coat she could no longer bear to wear. And a growing ache seated behind her ribs. The train sighed into the station with a metallic groan. Passengers surged around her, a rush of umbrellas and quick, damp footsteps. Nora stayed put a moment longer, breath shallow, pulse pounding in her ears. "Ma'am." The conductor's polite prompt tugged her back. "Last stop." She nodded and stood on unsteady legs. The platform was wet and cold, air heavy with the smell of soaked concrete and the faint bite of diesel. She followed the current into the city, steps tentative but deliberate. She drifted through unfamiliar streets, the weight of solitude settling heavier with each block. Towering buildings overhung her path, their shadows submerging her in a tide of strangers. With unsteady hands, she found a modest hotel on a quieter street and paid for a week. The room was small, walls a tired beige, but warm and dry. She set the suitcase by the bed and sank onto the mattress, head falling into her hands. The tears started slow, then broke open, racking her shoulders. The scale of what she'd left behind rose up and swallowed her, wave after wave of grief and exhaustion. But as the night wore on, a strange stillness settled over her. Her tears dried, leaving only the faint tremor in her chest. She lay back on the bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, her breathing steadying. Tomorrow, she thought to herself. Tomorrow, I'll figure it out. The city outside hummed with life, its heartbeat steady and relentless. For the first time in weeks, Nora let herself close her eyes, holding on to the smallest flicker of resilience. She was still here. And that, for now, was enough. Nora stirred awake to a dull ache in her temples, the faint hum of city noise seeping through the paper-thin hotel walls. The sunlight that filtered in through the faded curtains felt sharp against her swollen eyes. She sat up slowly, her body heavy, her mind heavier. Yesterday's storm, both literal and emotional, still lingered in her bones. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, planting her feet on the cold floor. The mirror above the dresser reflected someone she barely recognized. Hollow eyes, disheveled hair, and a pallor that made her look like a ghost. But as she stared, something flickered in her gaze, a trace of defiance, faint but present. She pulled on her cardigan and decided to take the first step toward rebuilding her life. The nausea hit her a week later. It wasn't sudden, but it came often, waves of unease rising in her stomach each morning. At first, Nora dismissed it as stress, or the consequence of days spent eating little more than crackers and tea from a nearby diner. But as the dizziness persisted, a gnawing thought crept into her mind, one she was too afraid to name. The confirmation came in the form of a doctor's soft, matter-of-fact voice. "Miss, you're pregnant. In fact, you're expecting twins." Nora froze, her hands gripping the edges of the chair as if the ground beneath her had shifted. The small, sterile room felt suddenly too bright, too confined. She didn't answer right away, letting the doctor's words settle like ripples on a pond. Twins. The word felt surreal, both a gift and a burden. "Are you all right, miss?" the doctor asked gently, his brows furrowed with concern. She nodded slowly, the knot in her throat tightening. "Yes," she whispered. I just need a moment." She walked out of the clinic, clutching the thin sheet of paper that listed her due date and basic health instructions. The cold January wind whipped around her, but Nora barely felt it. Fear, joy, and a fierce resolve simmered beneath her thoughts. She stopped by the park, finding a bench dusted with snow. Sitting down, she traced her fingers over the paper, her breath puffing in the frigid air. Graham's face flashed in her mind, his cold detachment, his clipped words. He would never know. He had forfeited the right to. For her unborn children, she resolved that the sterling name and everything it stood for would never touch them. Nora threw herself into building a new life. She found a small apartment on the outskirts of Seattle, just big enough to accommodate a crib when the time came. The building was old, the walls thin enough to hear her neighbors arguing, but it was hers. She worked at a local cafe, long shifts that left her feet aching but her wallet marginally fuller. It was there that she first met Daniel, a regular customer with a kind smile who tipped generously and always asked how she was holding up. She was polite but guarded, her focus entirely on survival and the growing lives inside her. By the third trimester, her belly was round and heavy, and her movements slower. She spent evenings knitting small sweaters she hoped would keep her twins warm in the Seattle winters. The routine of it, simple, methodical, steadied her in ways she couldn't explain. The labor came in the early hours of a cold April morning. Nora woke with a start, her breath hitching as pain rippled through her body. The next hours were a blur of sharp contractions, rushing to the hospital in a cab, and the antiseptic smell of the delivery room. "Push, Nora," the nurse urged, her voice steady. "You're almost there." Nora clenched her teeth, tears cascading down her cheeks as she delivered a final push. The piercing cry of a baby filled the room, and then another. The sound was raw, life-affirming. She collapsed back against the pillows, her chest heaving as the nurse gently placed 2 swaddled bundles in her arms. 2 identical faces stared up at her, their tiny features soft and delicate. Caleb and Owen. She had chosen the names quietly in the stillness of her apartment long before this moment. Now seeing them, they felt perfect. She traced a finger along Caleb's tiny cheek, then Owen's. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they weren't from pain. They were from love so overwhelming it hurt chest ache. "I'll protect you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No matter what." Back in her apartment a week later, the 3 of them settled into a rhythm. It wasn't easy. Sleepless nights, endless bottles to prepare, and the constant hum of exhaustion. But Nora persevered. The boys' laughter, even in its infant form, became her anchor. Each night as she held them close, she found herself repeating the same quiet promise. "You'll never know the pain I did," she murmured, her voice steady even when her heart wavered. "You'll grow up free from all of it." Her love for Caleb and Owen became her purpose, her drive, and her redemption. And in their presence, she began to feel whole again. The Sterling ballroom glimmered with opulence, yet it felt hollow. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the gathered elite, their laughter and polite chatter echoing off the marble floors. Graham Sterling stood at the altar, his posture stiff, his face carefully neutral. Beside him, Sloane Pierce, a vision in silk and lace, smiled faintly, her beauty cold and calculated, like a porcelain doll made to be admired but never touched. The officiant's voice droned on, but Graham's mind wandered. He barely registered the words binding him to this new life, each syllable a chain tightening around his chest. His gaze flitted to his mother, Evelyn, seated in the front row. She was radiant, her eyes gleaming with triumph as she nodded approvingly. This was her victory, not his. Sloane's hand slipped into his, cool and weightless. Graham forced himself to look at her, murmuring the vows he had rehearsed. The room erupted in applause as they exchanged rings, but the sound felt distant, muted. The kiss they shared was brief and devoid of passion, a hollow gesture for the sake of appearances. Later, at the reception, Graham stood by the grand fireplace, a glass of champagne in hand. He stared at the flames, their warmth failing to reach him. Around him, guests mingled, offering congratulations that felt more like obligations. Sloane flitted between conversations, her laughter polite but strained. She caught his eye briefly, her smile faltering before she turned away. Graham took a long sip of his drink, the bitterness burning his throat. His thoughts drifted to Nora. He pictured her the way she had looked the last time he saw her, rain-soaked, her suitcase in hand, her eyes filled with heartbreak. The memory clawed at him, but he pushed it aside. Regret wouldn't change the path he had chosen. Evelyn was completely comfortable in her surroundings. She moved through the room with practiced ease, basking in the compliments of her peers. A perfect match, they said. The Sterlings and the Pierces. What a union! Her lips curved into a satisfied smile as she glanced at Graham and Sloane standing side by side, like chess pieces she had expertly positioned. But her satisfaction was short-lived. Sloane gave birth to a baby girl 9 months later. The nursery, once filled with anticipation, grew cold as Evelyn's disappointment became clear. Hadley, Sloane had named her, the name chosen without Evelyn's input. Evelyn's reaction was subtle but biting. "A daughter," she said, her voice carefully measured. "Well, at least she's beautiful." Sloane stiffened, cradling Hadley closer. "She's perfect," she replied, her tone edged with defiance. Evelyn offered a tight smile, but her dissatisfaction was evident. Hadley wasn't the heir she had envisioned. Evelyn's subtle criticisms grew sharper over time. Comments about Hadley's delicate health, her temperament, even the way Sloane parented. Only fleeting glances and clipped conversations revealed the simmering tension beneath the surface. Graham, meanwhile, drifted. His days blurred into the rituals of the family enterprise, his nights into the hollow quiet of the house. The marriage to Sloane was courteous but remote. They traded pleasantries, every exchange precise and contained. He saw with a dull ache that Sloane was as trapped by the arrangement as he was. In the still hours, his mind circled back to Nora more than once. His hand went to the desk drawer where he kept a single hidden photograph, Nora on their honeymoon, hair wind-tossed, laughter bright in her eyes. He would trace her image with his thumb, the ache sharpening. Where was she now? What was she doing? Did she hate him? Was she happy? The question stalked him, answers forever out of reach. One night in the study, Hadley's cries threaded faintly down the hall, followed by Sloane's soothing, exhausted murmur. Graham stared into his whiskey, the amber catching the light. His life, he realized, was a carefully staged display. The legacy his mother had insisted he preserve felt like a gilded cage, each bar forged from choices he could no longer undo. He rose, photograph still in hand, and went to the window. City lights spread beneath him, a constellation of all the possibilities he had let go. Somewhere out there, she existed beyond his grasp. The thought both consoled and tormented. Pressing his forehead to the cold glass, he let his breath fog the pain. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the night, with no one to hear. The Sterling mansion held its grandeur, but hairline cracks widened daily. Evelyn's iron hold on the family began to slip as Sloane pushed back, intent on shielding Hadley from her mother-in-law's cutting standards. Graham retreated further inward, his regrets festered like an old wound. In the dim corners of his golden life, the memory of Nora burned like a low, steady flame, a reminder of what he'd lost and could never reclaim. Across the city, a small cafe on the edge of downtown had become Nora's second home. The chipped tables and mismatched chairs lacked glamour, but the steady cadence of work gave her control. Behind the counter, the hiss of the espresso machine mingled with the murmur of conversations and the occasional burst of laughter. It was an ordinary morning when Daniel walked in for the first time. Nora stood at the register, a dusting of flour on her apron from the pastry case. A tall man in a navy coat stepped up. "Just a black coffee, please," he said, voice warm, direct. She keyed in the order on the old till and passed him his change. As he took it, his smile flickered unforced, real. "Thanks," he said, hazel eyes lingering an extra beat before he moved away. Nora inclined her head, already greeting the next customer. Daniel chose a seat by the window, set a small notebook on the table, and watched the steam curl from his cup as the city moved on outside. Their paths crossed again a week later, this time under less mundane circumstances. Nora was at the playground with Caleb and Owen, the twins giggling as they toddled after each other in the damp grass. A sharp cry broke the peace as Caleb tripped, falling face first onto the ground. "Caleb!" Nora rushed to him, scooping him up. Blood trickled from a small cut on his knee, and his wails grew louder. Panic bubbled in her chest. She had nothing but a tissue in her pocket and no idea how to properly clean the wound. "Here," came a familiar voice. She turned to see Daniel jogging toward them, a small first aid kit in hand. He crouched down, his coat brushing the ground as he opened the kit with practiced ease. "I'm a doctor," he explained, glancing up briefly as he pulled out an antiseptic wipe. "May I?" Nora hesitated, then nodded. Daniel cleaned the wound with gentle precision, murmuring softly to Caleb to distract him. "There we go." "All better," he said, securing a bandage in place. Caleb's sobs had subsided into hiccups, his tear-streaked face now full of curiosity as he stared at Daniel. "Thank you," Nora said quietly, her voice edged with both gratitude and exhaustion. Daniel stood, brushing off his knees. "It's no trouble. I work at the clinic down the street. I see little ones like this all the time." Over the weeks that followed, Daniel's presence became a quiet but steady part of Nora's life. He stopped by the cafe regularly, sometimes with a book tucked under his arm, sometimes with a small gift for the boys, coloring books, toy cars, things he claimed were just lying around. Nora found herself talking to him more, their conversations light and unassuming at first. They talked about Seattle winters, the best coffee spots in the city, and the occasional chaos of raising toddlers. Daniel listened more than he spoke, his questions thoughtful and his laughter easy. One day, as they sat outside during a rare warm afternoon, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "You've built something special here," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the cafe and the bustling street. "It's not easy raising two boys on your own." Nora's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. She gave a small shrug, her voice guarded. "You do what you have to." Daniel didn't press, sensing the wall she had quietly erected. Instead, he shifted the conversation, telling her about his time working in a small rural hospital and the quirks of his patients there. Nora found herself smiling despite herself, the tension easing from her shoulders. Daniel's affection for Nora grew in the small moments, when she carefully tucked a blanket around a sleeping Owen at the cafe, or when her laugh, rare but genuine, lit up her face. But he never said anything, aware of the guardedness in her every gesture, the way she avoided speaking about her past. One evening, as they walked back from the park with the twins, Daniel spoke softly. "You know, Nora, you don't always have to carry everything alone." She stopped, her hands tightening on the stroller handle. The streetlights cast a soft glow on her face, and for a moment, she didn't respond. "It's not about carrying it alone," she said finally, her voice steady but distant. "It's about knowing you can't drop it." Daniel didn't push, but the look he gave her was one of quiet understanding. They continued walking in silence, the twins babbling softly to each other in the stroller. Nora appreciated Daniel's presence, but she couldn't allow herself to lean on him, no matter how much easier it might make things. Her scars ran too deep, her trust too fragile. Yet, as weeks turned into months, she found herself looking forward to their conversations, their quiet moments of companionship. Daniel never pried, never pushed. He was there, steady and patient like the tide. And while Nora's heart remained guarded, a small part of her began to wonder if perhaps she didn't have to face the world entirely alone. The windy city greeted Graham Sterling with its characteristic blend of noise, steel, and endless motion. He stepped off the train with his briefcase in hand, the worn leather a testament to years of business trips and negotiations. Seattle wasn't unfamiliar, but this time its streets felt different. The towering buildings seemed more oppressive, the bustling crowds a stark contrast to the isolation he carried within. He adjusted his tie, loosening it slightly as he checked his phone for the itinerary Evelyn had meticulously curated: a meeting with investors, a dinner with potential clients. The usual grind. The weight of expectation pressed against his chest, as suffocating as ever. Yet, beneath it all was a hollow ache, a void that the success Evelyn lorded could never fill. Later that afternoon, his meeting concluded earlier than expected. Graham wandered through Cary Park, his polished shoes incongruous against the worn concrete paths. The laughter of children rang out across the open spaces, their voices punctuated by the occasional bark of a dog or the rustle of wind through budding trees. It was uncharacteristic of him to linger, but something about the park's energy stilled his typically restless mind. As he approached a bench near a playground, a flash of movement caught his eye. A woman crouched beside two young boys. They were laughing, their identical faces glowing with delight as they tussled over a toy truck. Graham froze mid-step, his breath hitching. The woman turned her head slightly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her profile was unmistakable, etched in his memory like an indelible mark. Nora. 7 years have passed since she left. Graham's chest tightened. His gaze darted to the boys again, their features now under closer scrutiny. His heart thudded against his ribs as realization struck. Their sandy brown hair, the sharp line of their jaws, even the way one boy furrowed his brows in concentration. It was as if he were looking at his own childhood photographs. Graham retreated to a bench several yards away, sitting heavily as he tried to steady his breath. He observed the unfolding scene from the edge of his vision. Nora laughed softly as she helped one boy zip his jacket, the other clinging to her arm. Her movements were fluid, practiced, the gestures of a mother deeply attuned to her children's needs. Guilt clawed at him, raw and relentless. He had done this. He had pushed her away, abandoned her to a world where she'd had to face this alone. And yet, here she was, resilient and radiant in a way he didn't deserve to witness. He felt like an intruder, his presence an unwelcome shadow in her sunlit world. The curiosity gnawed at him, relentless and insidious. How had she ended up here? Had she ever thought of him? And the boys, were they his? The following days found Graham distracted, his work a blur of half-hearted conversations and hollow pleasantries. He returned to the park more than once, each time keeping his distance, watching Nora from afar. He noticed the way she carried herself, her movements confident but edged with a subtle caution. She spoke gently to the boys, her words laced with patience and warmth. One afternoon, as Nora corralled the boys toward a nearby cafe, Graham followed at a careful distance. The sign above the door read Harbor and Hearth Cafe, its chipped paint a stark contrast to the glossy coffee shops he frequented. Through the window, he saw Nora behind the counter, her apron tied snugly around her waist as she handed a steaming mug to a customer. Graham lingered outside, the chill in the air seeping into his skin. He couldn't bring himself to go in. The questions swirling in his mind felt too heavy, the confrontation too sudden. Instead, he resolved to uncover the truth another way. Back at his hotel that evening, Graham spread out the documents he'd commissioned from a private investigator. The reports were brief, but damningly clear. Nora had left for Seattle soon after their split, taking modest jobs while raising two boys, Caleb and Owen. Their ages lined up uncomfortably close to the timeline of their last days together. His fingers tightened on the paper's edge. The truth was inescapable. They were his. Regret settled heavy in his chest. Memories surged: Nora's laughter, the gentleness of her touch, the way she had looked at him with unshaken trust. He had shattered that trust, and with it, forfeited 6 years of a life that might have been his. The photo attached to the report felt like a taunt. Nora in the middle, Caleb and Owen flanking her, both boys grinning, eyes bright with a joy Graham hadn't felt in years. He leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. The life he'd curated, marriage to Sloane, dutiful sterling heir, hollowed out in the face of this new reality. By morning, he was at the park again. Nora stood where she often did, her sons chasing each other around the swings. This time he didn't stay hidden. He stepped forward, heart hammering, 7 years of guilt and longing pressing hard against his ribs. "Nora," he called softly. She turned, confusion sliding into shock. For a breathless moment, neither spoke. The world seemed to pause. Children's laughter receded to a distant hum. "Graham," she said at last, voice steady but guarded. In that instant, the past slammed into the present, tangling their lives again in ways neither had planned. Nora froze, gaze locked on him. The park's warmth, the chatter, the squeak of chains, the soft murmur of parents dulled beneath the weight of his presence. He looked older, his once rigid posture edged with something gentler, cracked. "What are you doing here?" she asked, tone even but razor sharp. He hesitated, hands buried in his coat pockets. "I'm here for work," he said quietly. "I didn't know. I didn't expect." His eyes flicked to Caleb and Owen, now watching from the swings. His voice thinned. "They're mine, aren't they?" Nora's jaw set. Her hands came to her sides, as if to shield her boys from his words. "It doesn't matter," she said, cold as rain. "You made your choice years ago." He flinched, the guilt he'd carried swelling to a breaking point. "I didn't know, Nora. I didn't know about them." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a hard whisper. "You didn't know because you never cared to ask. You threw me away like nothing, Graham. And now, after 7 years, you think you can just walk back into my life?" Graham's gaze dropped to the ground. "It wasn't like that," he murmured, though the words felt hollow even to him. "Oh, wasn't it?" Nora snapped, her voice rising. "Because from where I stood, it was exactly like that. You chose your family, your legacy, and your precious image over me. Over us." The raw pain in her words pierced Graham more deeply than he expected. He struggled for something to say, some way to explain the years of silence, the regret that had gnawed at him every day since she left. "I was wrong," he said finally, his voice trembling. "I was weak, and I'm sorry." Nora's expression softened for a brief moment before hardening again. "Sorry isn't enough," she said, her voice quieter now but no less resolute. "Not after everything I've been through. Not after everything they've been through." Graham glanced at the boys again. Caleb was whispering to Owen, their small faces a perfect mirror of his own childhood. "I just want to be part of their lives," he said. "I don't want to take them away from you, Nora. I just want to be there." Her laugh was bitter, her head shaking. "Be there? Like you were there for me? Like you were there when I was pregnant and terrified and completely alone?" She crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes narrowing. "You don't get to swoop in now and act like some savior." Graham took a step closer, his voice soft but insistent. "I'm not asking to take over. I'm asking for a chance. For them. For you." Nora's lips tightened into a thin line. "There is no us, Graham. Not anymore. I've moved on." The words hit him like a punch, and he stiffened. "You're seeing someone?" "Yes," she said, her tone unwavering. "Daniel. He's kind, dependable, and he doesn't abandon the people he loves when things get hard." Graham's jaw clenched. The name stung, not because he knew Daniel, but because it confirmed that Nora had built a life without him, a life he had no part in. "I'm glad," he said finally, though the words felt bitter in his mouth. "But I still want to be there for Caleb and Owen." Nora's stance remained firm. "You don't get to disrupt their lives because of your guilt. They're happy, Graham. They have stability, love, and a home. What can you offer them?" A father who walked away before they were even born. His chest tightened, but he refused to back down. A chance to know the truth. To know their father. Nora sighed, her exhaustion permeating her resolve. "And what happens when you go back to Boston? Back to your wife? Your mother? Do you really think you can be the father they need while you're tangled in the life you chose?" Graham's face paled at her words, but he didn't falter. "I just want to try, even if it's only as a friend. Please, Nora." She studied him for a long moment, her heart warring with itself. A part of her yearned to permanently close this chapter of her life. But there was another part, a smaller, quieter part, that still longed for some semblance of closure, for her boys to know their father, if only in fragments. "Fine," she said at last, her voice low and clipped. "But on my terms. And the moment I think this is hurting them, you're gone." Graham nodded, a wave of relief sweeping over him. "Thank you," he whispered. "Don't thank me," Nora said sharply, turning to gather her boys. "This isn't for you, Graham." He stood motionless as she walked away, Caleb and Owen gripping her hands tightly. The weight of his choices hung heavy around him, but for the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope, small, tentative, and fragile, but there. Evelyn Sterling had never been one to tolerate uncertainty. Information was her currency, and she had long mastered the art of unearthing secrets. The truth about Caleb and Owen came to her through carefully placed whispers, an unnamed informant from Graham's business dealings in Seattle. The news confirmed what she had long suspected. Graham's departure from tradition had not been without consequence. "Two boys," Evelyn murmured, her voice cold and calculating as she stared at the report in her hands. The investigators' photographs of Caleb and Owen glared back at her, two strikingly familiar faces, their resemblance to Graham undeniable. Her lips curled into a faint smile, the edges of her satisfaction tempered by disdain. She dismissed the file onto her ornate desk and glanced toward a family portrait on the mantel. Hadley's cherubic face stared back at her, framed by Sloane's proud but weary smile. Evelyn's own expression in the photograph was poised, perfect, an illusion she no longer cared to maintain. "A daughter," she scoffed under her breath, her tone dripping with disappointment. Hadley was an afterthought, a placeholder in a lineage that demanded strong male heirs. Caleb and Owen were different. They were the future of the Sterling legacy, and Evelyn was determined to bring them into the fold, whether Nora agreed or not. Sloane Pierce Sterling had grown used to the quiet battles that played out in the Sterling household. Evelyn's sharp remarks disguised as advice, Graham's distracted silences, the constant, suffocating weight of expectation. It all felt like an endless performance, and Sloane had been cast in a role she never auditioned for. But lately, the veneer had started to crack. She first noticed Evelyn's sudden interest in Graham's business trip to Seattle. The questions were subtle but pointed, the tension between them shifting. When Evelyn returned from a private meeting, her usually composed demeanor replaced by a razor-sharp focus. "What's in Seattle, Evelyn?" Sloane asked one evening, her tone casual but probing as they sat in the parlor. Evelyn's smile was tight, dismissive. "Opportunity," she replied. "For Graham. For the family. That's all you need to know." Sloane's unease deepened over the following weeks. Evelyn's disdain for Hadley became more pronounced, her remarks cutting deeper than before. Perhaps if she were more disciplined, Evelyn mused once after Hadley spilled her juice. Another time, a shame she's not a boy. The Sterlings need stability. The implications stung, but Sloane's growing frustration turned into resolve. Hadley wasn't Evelyn's pawn. She was going to let her daughter or herself be molded into something they weren't. The plane touched down in Seattle, and Evelyn stepped into the city with purpose. The limousine pulled up in front of Nora's modest apartment, a stark contrast to the Sterling estate's grandeur. Evelyn stepped out, her tailored coat pristine, her expression as frosty as the January air. Nora watched her approach from the window, a sense of foreboding settling in her chest. Daniel stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked, his voice steady. Nora nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Yes." Evelyn's knock was precise, and Nora opened the door to meet her former mother-in-law's piercing gaze. "Nora," Evelyn said smoothly, her tone almost cordial. "We need to talk." Daniel stepped forward, his presence a quiet but solid wall. Evelyn's eyes flicked to him briefly, dismissing him as one might a piece of furniture. "I see you've moved on," she said, her voice edged with mock civility. Nora declined the invitation. "What do you want, Evelyn?" Evelyn stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. her eyes scanning the humble space with thinly veiled disdain. "Caleb and Owen," she said bluntly. "They belong with their father's family." Nora's breath caught, but she refused to let Evelyn see her falter. "They belong with me," she said firmly. "They've always belonged with me." Evelyn arched an eyebrow, her expression almost amused. "And you've done admirably, given your circumstances. But let's be realistic, Nora. The Sterling name offers them opportunities you could never dream of." Nora stepped closer, her voice low and fierce. "You don't get to decide what's best for them. You didn't care about them when I was pregnant, and you don't care about them now. You only care about what they can do for you." Evelyn's smile was thin, her eyes gleaming with cold calculation. "Don't be naive. You think your little life here is enough for them? What happens when they start asking questions? When they realize what they're missing?" "They're missing nothing," Daniel interjected, his voice calm but firm. "They have a mother who loves them and a life filled with stability. That's more than any title or name could give them." Evelyn's gaze shifted to him, her disdain sharpening. "And who are you to involve yourself in family matters?" "I'm someone who cares about them," Daniel said evenly. "And someone who won't let you bulldoze over Nora or her sons." Evelyn's composure cracked for a moment, her lips thinning into a harsh line. She turned back to Nora, her voice colder than ever. "This isn't over. You can't keep them from their birthright." Nora's heart pounded, but her resolve didn't waver. "Watch me." Evelyn's departure was as swift as her arrival, the door closing behind her with a sharp click. Nora exhaled shakily, leaning into Daniel's steady presence. "She won't stop," she murmured, her voice trembling. "No," Daniel agreed, his hand warm against her back. "But neither will we." The Sterling mansion loomed with its usual oppressive grandeur as Graham stepped inside, the weight of returning to Boston settling hard across his shoulders. He had barely set down his briefcase when Sloane appeared in the hall, arms crossed, gaze cutting. "Evelyn went to Seattle, didn't she?" Her voice was even, but steel threaded through it. Graham stilled, jaw tightening. "Who told you?" "Hadley heard her on the phone," Sloane said, moving closer. Evelyn wasn't subtle about securing the family's future. "I know she went after Nora and your sons." He flinched, hands balling into fists. "Sloane, you knew," she said colder now. "You knew about them, about her, and you didn't think I deserved the truth?" He raked a hand through his hair, exhaustion scoring his features. "I didn't know until I went to Seattle," he said quietly. "I saw Nora, I saw Caleb and Owen. I know they're mine." Sloane's composure slipped for a beat. "And you kept it from me? From all of us?" "I didn't know how to tell you," he managed, voice fraying. "And I couldn't stop Evelyn. She cares only about the Sterling name, not what's right for anyone." Sloane held his eyes a long moment before answering, softer but unyielding. "Then you'd better decide what's right for you, Graham, before you run out of time." The house itself seemed to hum with tension, heavy with what hadn't been said. In the parlor, Sloane sat while Hadley played quietly on the rug. The sound of Graham's footsteps in the corridor made her shoulders tighten. She'd waited long enough. "Graham," she called, calm and resolute. He paused in the doorway, wary, then stepped in. "What is it, Sloane?" She rose, folding her arms. "We're going to talk about Seattle, about Evelyn, about all of it." He exhaled, the recent weeks weighing him down. "Sloane, I already told you." "No," she cut in, sharp. "You told me nothing. You dodged the truth until it couldn't be hidden. Evelyn's meddling, the boys, Nora, everything. And you let it happen." His shoulders sagged. He didn't argue. "I didn't know how to handle it," he said. Her voice broke with anger. "Of course you didn't. You've spent your life letting Evelyn call every shot. And now she's pulling Hadley and me down with you." Graham flinched, his guilt plain on his face. "That's not fair, isn't it?" Sloane's voice rose, her frustration spilling over. "You knew what Evelyn was planning, and you did nothing to stop her. Hadley is just a pawn to her, and you've allowed it. And now you expect me to stay and pretend everything is fine?" Graham opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth of her accusations weighed too heavy. Sloane took a deep breath, her voice softening but losing none of its resolve. "I'm leaving, Graham. I'm taking Hadley, and we're starting over somewhere Evelyn can't control us. Somewhere you can't let her." Graham's heart sank. "Sloane, please. Don't do this." She shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've left me no choice. I've tried to be patient, to protect Hadley from this toxic family. But I won't let her grow up thinking she's not enough, just because she's not what Evelyn wanted." Graham stepped forward, his voice pleading. "Sloane, I can change. I'll talk to Evelyn. It's too late, Graham," she said firmly. "I can't keep waiting for you to prioritize us over her. Hadley deserves better. I deserve better." The following morning, Sloane packed quietly, her movements deliberate and careful. Hadley sat on the bed, clutching a small stuffed bear, her big eyes watching her mother with a mix of confusion and sadness. "Are we going on an adventure, Mommy?" Hadley asked softly. Sloane knelt beside her, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. "Yes, sweetheart. A big adventure. Just you and me." Hadley smiled faintly, the innocence in her expression breaking Sloane's heart. She hugged her tightly, whispering a promise to herself to give Hadley a life free from the suffocating grasp of the sterling name. Graham stood in the foyer as Sloane descended the grand staircase with their suitcases in tow. He looked at her, his eyes pleading, but he didn't stop her. He knew he had no right. "Goodbye, Graham," she said quietly, her tone devoid of malice but heavy with finality. He watched as she walked out the door, Hadley's hand in hers. The sound of the car engine starting and fading into the distance was the only thing that broke the silence. The knock on Nora's apartment door was sharp and deliberate. Daniel's brows furrowed as he glanced toward Nora, who stood frozen, her hand tightening around a dish towel. She didn't need to ask who it was. "I'll get it," Daniel said, stepping forward. "No," Nora whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I'll handle her." Evelyn Sterling stood on the threshold, her tailored coat impeccable, her expression as cold as the Seattle winter outside. "Nora," she said smoothly, her tone laced with feigned politeness. "May I come in?" Nora stepped outside, closing the door behind her to shield Caleb and Owen from Evelyn's presence. "We don't have anything to discuss," Nora said firmly, folding her arms. "Oh, but we do," Evelyn replied, her gaze sharp and assessing. "Those boys are Sterlings. They deserve the opportunities this family can provide." Nora's eyes narrowed, her voice rising. "They deserve a life where they're loved for who they are, not what they represent to someone like you." Evelyn tilted her head, her expression almost amused. "You really think this small life you've built is enough for them?" With your companion, her gaze flicked dismissively to the closed door, playing the role of father? "Don't be naive." Nora stepped closer, her voice low and fierce. "You don't get to decide what's enough for my children. You don't get to come here and act like you care about them. They're not pawns in your power games, Evelyn. They're my sons, and they're staying with me." The door opened behind Nora, and Daniel emerged, his presence solid and calm. "She's made herself clear," Daniel said, his voice firm. "You should leave." Evelyn's composure cracked, her lips thinning. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her cold arrogance faltering. "The Sterling name. Enough." The voice came from behind her, and Evelyn stiffened. Graham stood at the base of the apartment steps, his face pale but determined. He rushed back to Seattle after learning that his mother would bother Nora. Mother. "Let it go." Evelyn turned sharply, her disbelief evident. "Graham, this is about the family." "No," Graham interrupted, his voice steelier than Nora had ever heard. This is about you and your obsession with control. Let them go." Evelyn's mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time, she saw the resolve in her son's eyes, and it unnerved her. With a final withering look, she turned and strode away, her heels clicking against the pavement. When Evelyn was gone, the tension between Nora and Graham was palpable. Daniel stepped aside, his gaze flickering between them before retreating back into the apartment to give them privacy. "Thank you," Nora said after a moment, her voice guarded. Graham nodded, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. "I didn't come here to fight, Nora. I just ... I needed to make sure she wouldn't hurt you. Or them." Nora crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "Why now, Graham? Why not 7 years ago?" Graham's shoulders slumped. "Because I was a coward. Because I let her dictate my life, and I let you pay the price for it." He looked up, his gaze softening. "I've made a lot of mistakes, Nora, but I don't want to make another one." Nora's voice wavered with emotion. "What do you want, Graham?" "I want you to be happy," he said simply. "With Daniel. With the boys. I don't deserve to be part of their lives, not after everything I've done. But I'd like to be here, even if it's just from a distance, to see them grow up." Nora studied him, her heart conflicted. The man before her was no longer the Graham she had known, arrogant, controlled by ambition. He looked broken, remorseful. But there was something else in his eyes, sincerity. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she admitted, her voice quiet. Graham nodded. "I don't expect you to. But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be someone worth forgiving." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Nora standing on the porch. Her emotions a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and an odd sense of closure. She turned back to the apartment, where Daniel was waiting with a quiet strength that steadied her. As she entered and shut the door, she sensed the burden of the past dissipating, creating space for the life she had tirelessly strived to establish. The sun was warm on Nora's face as she walked hand in hand with Caleb and Owen through the park. Daniel strolled beside her, a soft smile playing on his lips as the boys dashed ahead to the playground. Their laughter rang out, bright and carefree, a melody that filled the once empty corners of Nora's heart. "Watch me, Mom," Caleb called, climbing the jungle gym with determination. "Be careful," Nora called back, though her smile betrayed her pride. Daniel leaned closer, his voice low and teasing. "You know he's not going to slow down," Nora laughed softly. "I know, but it's a mother's job to worry." Daniel reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "And you do it beautifully." Nora experienced a complete release from the burden of her past for the first time in years. She glanced at Daniel, gratitude and love filling her gaze. This was her family now, a life she had built with resilience and a strength she never thought she possessed. Back in Boston, Graham sat alone in his study. The Sterling mansion was unnaturally quiet. On his desk lay a photo Nora had sent of Caleb and Owen at the playground. He traced a finger over their smiling faces, a wistful ache settling in his chest. He glanced out the window at the sprawling estate, its grandeur hollow without the family he had lost. The echoes of Evelyn's ambition and his own cowardice reverberated through the empty halls. He was uncertain if the wound caused by Sloane's departure would ever heal, and Hadley's laughter had become a distant memory he longed to reclaim. Graham knew he couldn't undo the years of pain he had caused, but he wasn't willing to lose more. A plane ticket to San Diego sat beside the photograph, Sloane's last known address scribbled in the corner. For once, Graham felt a spark of resolve, a determination to try to find Hadley and Sloane, to make amends no matter how difficult the path. Evelyn sat alone in the vast parlor, the firelight throwing restless shadows across her carefully arranged features. She had pushed away everyone she claimed to cherish, Graham, Sloane, even Hadley. The empire she'd fought to protect now felt like a hollow monument to her ambition. She reached for the family portrait on the mantel, fingertips drifting over the familiar faces. For the first time in years, her poise fractured. A single tear slipped free. The legacy she had guarded so fiercely had cost her everything. Dusk settled over Seattle as Nora, Daniel, Caleb, and Owen gathered on a picnic blanket beneath a scatter of stars. The boys leaned in close, eyes wide, while Daniel spun tales of constellations and legendary creatures. Nora watched them, heart steady and full. The past had left its marks, but it hadn't broken her. She had found love, laughter, and a joy she once believed out of reach. Daniel glanced over, voice gentle. "Are you happy?" Nora's smile trembled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Yes," she whispered. "I really am." And with the night sky glittering above, she knew this was only the start of a brighter, more hopeful chapter. If this film moved you, show your support with a like and remember to subscribe to our channel for more meaningful stories. Share your thoughts and tell us your own experiences. Every comment helps strengthen our community. Together, we're building a warm, welcoming space where everyone can connect. And don't miss the powerful stories coming soon. We're here to bring you the very best, rich in heart, yet always entertaining. See you there.